Vietnam's jungles contained more than just enemy soldiers. They harbored some of the most terrifying insects American troops would ever encounter. This comes directly from U.S. Army medical bulletins, veteran memoirs, field hospital reports, and documented incidents that show these weren't just scary stories around the campfire. Some insects put entire units out of commission. Some caused evacuations to Japan. Some literally turned weapons against the soldiers who carried them. If you're a veteran watching this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you shook out your boots religiously. Maybe you spent sleepless nights on guard duty, hearing something moving in your gear. For everyone else, understand this. These six-legged enemies were so feared that soldiers would rather face the Viet Cong than encounter them in the dark. Picture waking up to find a 10-inch venomous creature coiled inside your machine gun, or having your tank overrun by thousands of biting ants. Let's start with the giant tropical centipede. The Vietnamese giant centipede measured up to 10 inches long and moved with terrifying speed through the darkness. American soldiers called it the worst thing they encountered in the jungle, worse than snakes, worse than spiders. There's a reason for that. These creatures didn't just bite. They injected venom through modified front legs that worked like hypodermic needles. The venom contained serotonin, histamine, and cardiotoxic peptides that attacked both the nervous system and destroyed tissue. Within minutes, victims experienced burning pain that felt like molten metal poured into the wound. The pain lasted 24 to 48 hours. Swelling spread up the entire limb. Some bites caused the flesh around the wound to die and turn black. Military medical records from the 1960s document at least one fatal bite from this species. A 7-year-old girl in the Philippines who died 29 hours after being bitten on the head. That case reinforced every rumor circulating among American troops that these things could kill you. What made them truly terrifying was where they hid. Giant centipedes squeezed into boots, sleeping bags, and weapon crevices during the day, then emerged at night when soldiers were most vulnerable. Airman Jim Randall of the 483rd Security Police Squadron discovered one coiled inside his M60 machine gun at Cam Ranh Bay in 1970. When he field-stripped the weapon, the centipede uncoiled and charged directly at him. He abandoned his bunker and spent the entire night 20 feet away, still on duty, but unable to use his primary defensive position. The next night, another airman named Wheeler took the same bunker. A centipede bit him in the back while he leaned against the sandbags. His back swelled so severely that other soldiers compared it to the hunchback of Notre Dame. Wheeler was evacuated to Japan. Randall never learned if his friend survived. This single incident shows how one arthropod neutralized a critical fighting position for 2 consecutive nights. The psychological impact spread throughout entire units as soldiers became obsessive about checking their gear, adding time to every pre-mission ritual and eroding precious rest periods. But centipedes weren't the only insects turning the jungle canopy into a weapon against American forces. American soldiers nicknamed them communist ants for their red and green coloring and apparent hostility to everything American. The weaver ants of Vietnam built massive colonies containing over 100,000 workers in leaf nests high in the jungle canopy. They formed entire ant cities above the routes where American convoys traveled. These weren't ordinary ants. Weaver ants attacked with powerful mandibles that bit through thin fabric, then sprayed formic acid from their abdomens directly into the wounds. The acid burned like fire and caused severe inflammation that could trigger dangerous allergic reactions. Standard army insect repellent had no effect on them. They seemed immune. When disturbed, entire colonies swarmed simultaneously. Thousands of ants poured down from the trees within seconds, covering exposed skin and biting repeatedly. The pain was intense enough to stop movement entirely or force armored vehicle crews to abandon their tanks. Tank crews suffered the worst encounters. When armored vehicles knocked down trees holding weaver ant nests, ants rained through open hatches and vision ports into the steel hull. The confined space trapped both the ants and the crew together. Military history sources document crews abandoning combat-effective vehicles or fighting stripped down to underwear, sometimes completely naked, trying to escape the swarming insects. In multiple documented incidents, crewmen required medical attention for severe allergic swelling after being covered in dozens of painful bites. The tanks sat abandoned until the infestation could be cleared, rendering millions of dollars worth of armored firepower useless without a single enemy shot fired. The psychological impact spread beyond individual encounters. Every tree branch became suspect. Any vegetation overhanging a trail might hold a nest waiting to drop its contents on passing soldiers. Movement through the jungle started feeling like walking through a biological minefield, where the enemy could turn the entire ecosystem into a weapon. Soldiers developed a constant fear of the canopy above them. They knew that trees and branches weren't just potential cover for snipers. They were potential ammunition dumps full of creatures that could disable entire units through sheer overwhelming pain and chaos. But the ants were nothing compared to an enemy so small it was invisible, yet deadly enough to evacuate more American soldiers than combat wounds. The Anopheles mosquito carried malaria parasites that rendered entire American units' combat ineffective without firing a shot. In 1965, the number of U.S. soldiers evacuated for malaria equaled those evacuated for combat wounds. Malaria was the leading non-surgical cause of death in hospitalized troops. The numbers were staggering. By December 1965, the overall malaria rate in South Vietnam reached 98 cases per 1,000 troops per year. In the Ia Drang Valley, some units hit 600 cases per 1,000 per year. 2 entire maneuver battalions became combat ineffective, not from enemy fire, from mosquito bites. The parasites these insects carried were drug-resistant. Standard weekly chloroquine primaquine tablets failed against the Vietnamese strains of Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium vivax. Soldiers took their pills religiously and still ended up in hospital beds with high fevers, delirium, and severe anemia. At the 85th Evacuation Hospital, 35% of all medical admissions were malaria cases. 75% of those were the severe falciparum type that caused complications, including blackwater fever, where patients urinated blood, and cerebral malaria that produced neurological damage. Each falciparum case meant 30 to 35 days lost from duty. The prophylactic drugs made soldiers sick even when they worked. The pills caused stomach upset, insomnia, and in troops with certain genetic conditions, dangerous anemia. Some soldiers experienced anaphylactic shock from the medication itself. Men resented taking pills that made them feel terrible to prevent a disease they might never catch. But they caught it anyway. Every mosquito bite at night felt like potential hospitalization or evacuation home. Soldiers developed paranoia about something they couldn't see or fight. You could follow every protocol, take every pill, use every precaution, and still wake up weeks later in a hospital bed halfway around the world, burning with fever and too weak to stand. The psychological toll was enormous. Malaria felt random and unfair in a way that enemy bullets didn't. At least you could shoot back at the Viet Cong. But even the jungle's bloodsuckers weren't as disturbing as the creatures that attached themselves to soldiers and wouldn't let go. Leeches dropped silently from vegetation and attached under socks, waistbands, and in places soldiers discovered only when they found blood-soaked clothing or unexplained bleeding. The dense jungle and constant monsoon rains created perfect leech habitat everywhere American troops operated. Land leeches crawled on vegetation waiting for victims to brush past. They attached using saw-toothed jaws and injected powerful anticoagulants that kept wounds bleeding for hours after the leech was removed. Soldiers would discover dozens of them feeding simultaneously, turning their uniforms into bloody messes. The worst cases involved nasal leeches. A newly described species called Dinobdella ferox lived in jungle streams and attached to the inside of soldiers' noses and throats when they drank or swam in infested water. Men presented to field hospitals with persistent one-sided nosebleeds, nasal obstruction, severe anemia, and sometimes difficulty breathing. Vietnam-era medical case reports document young infantrymen who complained of something moving inside their noses after days of intermittent bleeding. Examination under anesthesia revealed live leeches attached high in the nasal cavity, feeding repeatedly and causing dangerous blood loss. Removal required surgical instruments and skilled medical support that wasn't always available at remote fire bases. Multiple leech bites caused severe blood loss, requiring hospitalization. The wounds often became infected in the field, creating ulcerated sores that wouldn't heal in the humid conditions. Some soldiers lost so much blood from simultaneous feeding that they required transfusions. The psychological impact was devastating. Leeches triggered intense disgust and a complete loss of bodily control. Soldiers felt like their own bodies were being consumed by creatures they couldn't see attaching. On night patrols, men would stop regularly to pluck dozens of land leeches from their legs and groin, a physically draining and psychologically brutal routine that sapped morale with every mission. The idea that something slimy was secretly drinking your blood or lodged inside your nose created paranoia about every scratch, every itch, every sensation. Soldiers obsessively checked themselves and each other, but the creatures were nearly impossible to prevent or detect until damage was already done. Unlike leeches that worked slowly and secretly, Vietnam's next insect threat announced itself with the roar of thousands of wings and turned nature itself into enemy artillery. The Asian giant honeybee formed exposed combs up to 3 feet across on cliffs and tree limbs throughout Vietnam. Disturbing a single nest unleashed thousands of large, aggressive bees armed with venom that could trigger anaphylactic shock and organ failure. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army learned to turn these hives into biological weapons. Enemy guerrillas relocated wild bee colonies to overhang heavily traveled American trails. They rigged small explosive charges or firecrackers to the hives, then detonated them as patrols passed underneath. The explosions enraged the bees, which swarmed down onto exposed soldiers in what troops called bee bombs. From tunnel complexes, the Viet Cong lobbed entire wasp and hornet nests into American positions to disrupt defenders before launching attacks. The insects provided perfect covering fire. They created chaos and panic without any metal signature that could be detected by standard mine or booby trap procedures. Bee venom contained melittin and phospholipase that attacked nerve tissue and destroyed cells. Multiple stings delivered enough toxin to cause systemic reactions, including dangerous drops in blood pressure and kidney damage. Stings to the face caused temporary blindness and complete disorientation, disastrous conditions during combat. Historical analyses document American infantry patrols moving along narrow jungle trails when hidden Viet Cong detonated charges attached to relocated hives overhead. Within seconds, hundreds of bees swarmed the squad, stinging faces, necks, and hands. Several men suffered dozens of stings each, with at least one experiencing near collapse and severe swelling requiring evacuation. The tactic was devastatingly effective. No metal components, no blast signature, almost impossible to detect with conventional sweep procedures. The noise and panic made patrols easy targets for follow-up small arms fire or allowed enemy forces to break contact safely. Weaponized bees created paranoia about every sound in the canopy. For soldiers with known bee allergies, the idea of bee bombs produced anxiety equal to conventional mines. The enemy had turned something normally natural into an ambush weapon, increasing suspicion about every aspect of the environment. The psychological impact went beyond individual encounters. Bees reinforced the feeling that the enemy could weaponize the entire ecosystem against American forces, making soldiers feel helpless against an environment that seemed actively hostile. But the final creature on our list made even the dark underground tunnels feel like death traps. Vietnamese giant scorpions reached 4 to 5 inches long, with massive pincers and robust segmented tails that delivered paralyzing venom. These black forest scorpions shared the same dark, cramped spaces where American tunnel rats worked and bunker troops slept. They also appeared in Viet Cong booby traps designed specifically to terrorize underground fighters. The Vietnam forest scorpion injected neurotoxic venom that caused intense local pain and swelling. While usually not life-threatening, the sting disabled the affected limb and felt like a severe bee sting that lasted for hours. In the confined darkness of tunnel systems, that temporary paralysis could mean death. Enemy forces rigged boxes and containers with tripwires to dump enraged scorpions on intruders exploring tunnel networks. Tunnel rats described reaching into pitch blackness and grabbing scorpions instead of enemy soldiers. Some veterans reported that scorpions and ants felt more frightening than the Viet Cong themselves in the suffocating underground maze. A contemporary soldier's diary from March 1967 records a typical incident. An infantry unit working around brush and earthworks had a squad leader stung by a scorpion. The sting was serious enough that the squad leader required evacuation to a hospital, though he eventually recovered and returned to duty. That evacuation illustrates the operational impact. Even non-lethal encounters removed small unit leaders at critical moments, temporarily disrupting command structure and forcing units to operate with reduced leadership. The incident became an object lesson for the entire unit about checking gear and clearing areas before settling in. Combined with snakes, spiders, bats, and stifling heat, scorpions made tunnel systems feel like hostile living organisms rather than military positions. For tunnel rats, the psychological impact was enormous. They developed claustrophobia, not just from tight spaces, but from the knowledge that every surface might hide something venomous, waiting in total darkness. Troops became obsessive about where they placed their hands, where they slept, and how they cleared brush. Every precaution slowed operations and increased stress levels. The scorpions reinforced the sense that Vietnam's underground war was fought against the environment itself as much as against human enemies. These 6 insects turned Vietnam's jungle into a biological weapons system that never stopped hunting American soldiers, creating fears that lasted long after the war ended.